So in this video, you'll see a walkthrough of two different installers for two different distributions of Linux, popOS and Manjaro. I'm going to show you how to install a new version of Linux on an old computer or laptop and make it run like new again. This method will allow you to install Linux and keep your old files and still be able to switch between Windows and Linux whenever you want, simply by restarting the computer, then choosing from the boot menu. I'll even show you how to boot from a burned DVD disk to run the installer, as well as the preferred approach of making a bootable USB thumb drive, just in case your computer, like mine, is too old to support booting from USB. The video's lack of smoothness is just the $12 device that I'm using to record the video. In real life, the computer's running a smooth 60 frames per second. It just looks a little bit skittish because I'm recording from a USB device. A proper capture card is like $50 at least, usually over 100, but this USB dongle is only like $12, so it's all I need to record what's happening on my laptop while it's restarting and installing, so that's the best we got. Very important though. You need some space on your hard drive first, ideally about 50 gigs, but more is always idealer. If you have a second hard drive, this process is much easier, but if you don't, this video is going to help you out a lot. So back up everything that's important to you before you start. There's a possibility of erasing everything on your computer by mistake, so you should be able to recover Windows, but your files may not be recoverable. A backup means saved on an external drive. If you save a backup on your hard drive and the hard drive gets erased, the backup will be gone too, so unless it's stored on a physical separate device. After the backup to an external drive, disconnect it from the computer you're working on and store it somewhere safe for now. This laptop I picked up for under $700 or over 10 years ago now. It was cheap even when I brought it brand new, so it's not very powerful by today's standards. So it can't run a current version of Windows at all, even if I wanted it to. But it can play movies, music, or vintage gaming emulators perfectly fine, so the computer runs. I ran a web design business and wrote 2 books on it, actually, as recently as 2016. It came pre-installed with Windows 7, upgradable to Windows 8, but both have long since been discontinued in terms of security updates and support and stuff. So this is a good reason to dual boot Linux on it though, so I can safely browse the web or do banking on an old 2010 PC in the year 2022. Linux updates are released constantly. They don't get discontinued like Windows or Mac do. So other reasons for dual booting Linux and Windows, I'll just say quickly, is let's say your computer crashes and it won't turn on anymore. Without another operating system, you can't even turn it on to access the internet to find out why it won't turn on anymore. So having a separate operating system means that once one crashes, you can use the other to recover it, or at least not be too interrupted by it, productivity-wise. Another might be for education, or to prevent a working laptop or DVD burner to go to waste. Another reason might be to run a basic movie or music game server in my house, share my music and stuff across other devices like smart TVs or Bluetooth speakers or whatever. If you've got some smart, curious kids, then a good reason would be to give them a leg up in life and help them learn Linux from a young age. So whatever your reasons are, this is a beginner's guide to dual booting Linux and an older version of Windows on an old computer or laptop. I wasn't going to do this tutorial initially since there are a number of very well done tutorials online already, but I realized most of them, or even all of them, were either dealing with older versions of Linux paired with older versions of Windows, or the videos used Windows 10 machines, which were mostly installed using a newer partition table that won't be found in Windows 7 or 8, so the installation was a bit different. So my personal preference is Linux Mint, but there's a bit of difficulty learning to install graphic drivers with that one, which you can find aplenty online if you've got the stomach for a bit of sleuthing. But this video is for people who just want to get up and running without spending days learning how to manually partition hard drives, specify mount points, or experiment with disk encryption or anything like that. So if you just need a computer to run, and you want to do things like email and banking or browse the web safely, but you can't do that on a Windows 7 or 8 computer because they don't have security updates anymore, then you can keep everything as it is with Windows 7 or 8 and have Linux on the side and use just boot into Linux when you want to do something that needs security updates, and use Windows for whatever else you keep it for. So with that, we'll just get started. So this is what it looks like to have a boot menu. Every time you turn the computer on, it just gives you the option to either boot into Linux. The distro in this case was Ubuntu, and Windows 7 is the Windows operating system. This is entering the BIOS just to check and change the boot order. Just if you've got a computer that's set up to only boot off the hard drive first, then no matter what you do with the USB or the DVD, it's not going to boot onto the live disk that we create. So you just have to go into the BIOS by hitting it tells you which key to hit when you turn it on, as you'll see that Acer logo said to hit F12 in my case. And then you just use the arrow keys and the enter key to change the settings, and just make sure you save them afterwards. You'll notice on mine on the right it says you have to move F5 to move it down the list and F6 to move it up the list. So just change the boot order to make sure that depending on the method you're going to be doing, whether it's USB or from a CD or DVD-ROM, just make sure that boot priority is higher up on the list. Otherwise it'll just keep booting into Windows over and over again when you restart. So this is my Windows desktop, and I've already pre-downloaded some ISO files. Those are disk image files, and I've got two here that I'm going to try out for today. That's Manjaro and popOS. So I'm just copying them over to my hard drive temporarily so that I can make disk images from them. They have to be specifically ISO files, but you can just download Linux because it's free. You can go to any distro's website and download those ISO files directly. And I'll fast forward a bit just so you don't have to watch it copy. I've got old USB on this old computer, so it's pretty slow. Now you'll notice Etcher setup there. It's a free program that runs on Windows, and you'll need that to create a disk image. That type of functionality is built into Linux, but with Windows you need to use Etcher. And now that that's installed, that free program Etcher, all I gotta do is check out my USB drive, and I'm just going to now format it to FAT32. exFAT will usually work, but not always, so it's easiest to just stick with what guaranteed to work. FAT32 is file allocation table, and you can name it whatever you want. It's just the name of the USB stick that we're going to be making a bootable installer for. Now this is that Etcher program we just installed. So you see it's very simple and straightforward, following the Linux philosophy. It just does one job and it does it well. So I'm going to go grab one of those ISO files I downloaded. Make sure you select the USB stick, because this is actually going to wipe it completely clean. So make sure there's nothing on there that you don't want to lose. I've just formatted it, so I'm guaranteed there's nothing on there. And then you hit flash, and you'll notice at the bottom there, it asks for permission. Just make sure you hit OK for that. And then you sit and wait. Doobie doobie, doobie doo. Doobie doobie, doobie doo. Skip ahead a little bit here. Now, I did sort of select these two specifically because they have the graphics drivers built in. Whether you're running Intel, nVidia, or AMD graphics, they should all work. That's just because it's a beginner's tutorial. If you're going to use a different distro, that's perfectly fine. They'll all work, but there might be a little bit of manual adjustments that you have to make, but there's tutorials all over the internet for that. You just gotta sort of do a quick Google search of your question and you will find step-by-step walkthroughs, no problem. So I'm going to start with popOS, and I'll start with the USB utility because my computer won't boot off the USB, but most of yours probably will. I'll do this same process again, but I'll do it by burning a DVD, and I'll be running the installer from Manjaro off the DVD. But just to show you the difference between two different distros, the installers just... some have more options than others, and one option in particular, if you want to dual boot Windows, like have Windows and Linux running at the same time, you got to have Windows installed first, and you got to pick a distro. Well, you don't have to, but just to make things easier, otherwise you have to do it manually. You want to pick a distro that has a feature that says install alongside Windows, as opposed to just erase the whole disk or manually partition yourself. And again, it's just because this is a tutorial for beginners. But if you're interested and you've got the time to spend, definitely recommend learn how to do it manually, because the deeper understanding you get for your own computer, the better you are. The better your experience will be, because you will have full control of everything on your system, and that's sort of the point. So I've got a free program called CD Burner XP. And I'm just going to launch that program and burn ISO image. And then from this menu here, you just hit the browse, because it says select image to burn. And I'm going to pick popOS. I'm not sure if it makes any difference that DVD high compatibility, but I figure it can't hurt. And then we wait. Doobie doobie, doobie doo-wah. Doobie 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 doo-wah. Chicka. I guess while we're waiting for this a little bit, I'll mention a few YouTubers not affiliated with this channel at all, or with me at all, but ones who helped me when I converted over to Linux and had to learn all this stuff myself. I did go the long route trying to and learned how to do all the partitioning manually, but I had a background in computer technician, so it wasn't all new to me. I can imagine it would be a little bit cumbersome for somebody who's never partitioned or created a partition table on a hard disk before. But the best way to do this, obviously, is with an extra hard drive. If you have a spare hard drive, then you really, I mean, this process will be the same for any distro of Linux that you want to try out and install. But the best approach is to use a separate hard drive so that you can just disconnect one, plug in the other one, and then you can choose the simplest installer option of just erase everything and install it. And then when you plug your Windows hard drive back in, boot from the Linux hard drive will then see the Windows, and it'll give you that boot menu anyway. So just something to keep in mind. Another point of note, too, is you can try out a distro of Linux from just these boot disks. Like, you don't even have to install the whole operating system. If you just want to see, like, the layout and the color schemes and where the settings are and just see that it's something you like, you can burn as many of these as you want because they're free, right? Or if you got USB drives, you can just burn a whole bunch of different images or flash a whole bunch of USB drives and have 6 of them lined up and just try one after the other without even installing it. You can just play around with the operating system from the USB or the DVD boot. But it will be a little bit slow because obviously if you're not running an operating system that's installed on your computer, then it's running off the disk, which is, or the USB drive or the CD-ROM drive. And that's obviously going to be slower than running off of a hard drive. So don't criticize its what do you call it? Its appeal, like the smoothness of it. That's not the point of the trial. The trial is just to see the layout and where the settings are, and whether you like the organization of like the settings and the menus and all that kind of stuff. But as I said, using CDs or DVDs is much slower than USB, and if you have a computer any newer than like 5 years ago, this process will be about 4 times faster, if not even more than that, because as I said, this is an exceptionally older computer, but it's still perfectly capable of running a brand new latest version of Linux, even though it can't even install an old version of Windows anymore. Windows 10 is now being leapfrogged by Windows 11. Mired by controversy with that too. They had a TPM module requirement for Windows 11 that wasn't required on Windows 10, so a whole bunch of brand new computer systems that just happen to not have this specific quote-unquote security module, the TPM module, on the motherboards that shipped with their computers. So even brand new computers that are powerful enough to handle Windows 11 can't. They'll probably change that by the time this video comes out, because people were up in arms, but it just goes to show these companies go out of their way to make your hardware not work on their software, and then they discontinue support for it just to force you to buy new computer hardware, because every one of those computers that you get Windows on for free, they paid a license to Microsoft. It's all about money. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit here. Good, now we've got our boot disk successfully completed. Then I just shut down the computer with the disk in. Remember, I've already changed the BIOS to boot off the CD or the USB stick. So that's what it's doing now that it's restarted. So start off with popOS, and again, don't mind that screen flicker, that's just the recording device. But no terminal here, no command line, it's just point and click, really straightforward. And you'll notice there's that clean install, erase everything. There's a refresh install and a custom or advanced. The advanced is what you do if you know what you're doing with partition tables and things like that. The clean install is what you do if you don't mind losing Windows and all your files, or if you've disconnected your Windows hard drive and you've got a completely empty new hard drive that you're going to use, you can do a clean install with that too. But again, it's all graphical, tons of pictures and details and explanations. And popOS is probably the newest one. You'd probably use this only if you're interested in gaming. That's sort of its focus, is it's compatible with the most games, and that's what the developers are really focusing on. Oh, one other thing to note too. Make sure you're connected to the internet. The install works much better and easier and faster if you have the internet connected. It'll download a bunch of the updates too while it's installing. I usually prefer to do it after, and I'm gonna probably do it after just to show you how to manage updates. Unlike Windows, they don't force you to do them, but they do have automatic updates by default, so it's not anything that you have to change, but it is an option to opt out of, which is a nice feature of Linux too. Fell asleep at the wheel here. And just to show you the advanced settings, it'll check all your devices on here, and then you can specify. Oops. You'll notice these are the partitions. I already have a version of Linux installed on this computer, but That's why you saw the boot menu earlier before. But I'm going to install a new version of Linux over top of that partition just to show you guys how that works. But these system reserved partitions, those are backup partitions. They're basically a space reserved on your hard drive to help you recover from catastrophic failure. If you've got like an e-machine or something, that's probably important to keep it. It'll have your CD key and stuff like that, I think, probably tied to it somehow. I've never used it, to be honest, because it's never been very useful to me, but I imagine it's there because it's useful to somebody. But yeah, so if you don't need Windows and you don't have to worry about any of this, it's just to show you that the advanced features are there, and instead of having to type, into a command line, you can actually drag and drop just blocks of pictures, and you can manage your partitions visually. So again, it's nothing crazy daunting, and I certainly recommend anybody who's interested actually go through with this the long way, just to get that thorough, deeper understanding of what's going on, but with your computer, so that there's nothing sneaky or hidden in there. Ooh. And you'll see you can change partition size just by dragging sliders, which is really convenient. I like that feature a lot. You used to have to do it manually in a command line, even with DOS. Installing Windows 95 and Windows 98 was like that. So yeah, I'll skip through just some details. And another interesting thing to note is the file systems that you create on these partitions. I use ext4 because I find it's really stable even from a crash. It'll be able to recover files from a crash because it sort of works like a transaction. It keeps a record of changes it's going to make before it makes them, so that if it gets interrupted halfway through and it corrupts the hard drive, the file system itself has built-in protections for that. So you sacrifice a little bit of hard drive space for it, but it's really fast and it's very stable, even when it does crash, which is handy. And remember, these are all like permanent changes you're making to your hard drive, so be sure you know what you're doing before you do all this. This isn't necessary for our purposes. I'm just showing you that it can be done and it's not big and scary. And this is just what it looks like when it reboots. So I'm going to do it again, but I'm booting off of the Manjaro disk this time, Manjaro Budgie. And this installer is similar to the popOS installer, but it's just slightly different. You'll notice it looks different, layout's a bit different, but it's just as easy to navigate. My internet's connected, so it's already picking out my region and keyboard, and this part's important. So if you want to keep Windows and dual boot, you want to get a distro of Linux that has an installer that shows this option at the top here, install alongside. The installer will shrink a partition to make room for Manjaro 20. So what it's going to do is all that technical stuff I just showed you briefly, it's going to do that for you without you having to look at it. The benefit to this is if you really don't have the interest in learning all this stuff and you just want to get the thing up and running, but you don't want to lose your ability to boot into Windows, this is the best approach. And even if you wanted a version like popOS that doesn't have this option of install alongside, what you can do is install Manjaro, and then after you're done installing Manjaro like this, using the install alongside option, you can then go back into you can then boot off your popOS, for example, which didn't have that option, and then you can choose replace a partition, and you could replace your Manjaro with popOS, and then you don't have to deal with all that partitioning and stuff. So just a neat little trick for you. So again, if you're installing this alongside Windows, you would pick the install alongside and you wouldn't have to do any of this. I'm doing this because I've already got a version of Linux installed on my on this laptop, and I'm just going to replace that version of Linux with this Manjaro version, or distribution. And again, everything's visual. No command line necessary. I mean, it's there if you really want it, but another thing to note is at the bottom there where it says bootloader location, that if you have two separate physical hard drives, you're going to want to make sure that you pick the one that you want it to boot from. And to get that boot window, or the option, every time you turn your computer on, you're going to want to boot from the Linux hard drive, the hard drive that Linux is installed on. And it will see Windows as a separate operating system, like another option to boot into, and it'll give you that option. But if you pick the Windows one, it's just going to keep going straight into Windows, and it'll never give you the Linux option. It's important to remember, too, that this is only complicated because Windows and Mac are so exclusive and commanding of your computer. It would be much simpler if they just worked nicely together. All of this complication is strictly down to the incompatibility of Windows with Linux. Nothing to do with the compatibility of Linux with Windows. And then it just starts installing. You can read through all the different features and developer notes as it goes along. I'm just going to fast forward it a bit because nobody needs to watch a progress bar. All done. Restart now. So next time it restarts, this is what you appeared with, and you just enter the password correctly, unlike I did. Then I just restart it again, and here you go. Oop. So now when I reboot my computer, Manjaro gives me this nice little window that says, hey, do you want to boot into Windows 7 or do you want to boot into Manjaro Linux? Manjaro is the distribution name or the distro name for the Linux version that we've just installed. And you'll notice that Windows recovery environment option. Usually with Windows, you'd have to do some type of special keying, like holding the left shift button down and right clicking the start menu and hitting something like that to get into recovery mode. But Linux just gives you the option right to your face without hiding it from you. And remember, this the mouse movement and stuff is stuttery because of the video capture device I'm using, the cheap little USB thing. It's actually 60 frames per second and smooth as butter. Manjaro's nice because the graphics drivers come pre-installed with it, so you don't have to worry about figuring out how to set up your display adapter or your video card or anything like that. And that's just an update notification. So this is sort of the equivalent of the start menu. It's on the top left for now, that's just the default, but you can move it, and I'll show you that later actually. You can even have 2 or 3 of them if you want. You're not just stuck with one taskbar, which is one of my favorite aspects of Linux actually, is that you can do anything you want to the taskbar. You can even change the symbol for the start button, but it's nice, neatly organized, nothing's hidden. Just like Windows, there's a search function. If you just start typing, it'll automatically just start looking for the things you type. Now I'm just running the graphical update. You can use the terminal, the command line if you want to run your updates. That's how I do it, just because I like to know absolutely every little detail of what's being installed on my computer for security reasons. I manage client information and private information for my own self, so I like to make sure I know what's on it. And Linux distributions also come with, I'll just show you a few errors I got too, just so you don't get scared if something comes up and says it doesn't work. I'll show you how to just quickly look things up and find out what the problem is, what went wrong, and how to fix it. But yeah, there's sort of like an equivalent to an app store, or I don't know what I can't remember what they call it in Apple, but Mac Store maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, there is what am I saying? Oh, there's a graphical store where you can pick up any type of application you want to get, and it'll give descriptions and how big the files is before you install it, and like the permissions it needs. So at least there's no like ads that are being pre-packaged with it. Whereas if you go to the Microsoft Store or the App Store, anything you get is just everything's hidden from you. They just tell you what it does, but they don't tell you, what it does in the background. But Linux is nice that way because they're open source. So if anybody did find some backdoor or some ad thing, they would just recompile the exact same program without the ads in it and then re-release it to everybody for free anyway. So no ads is nice. And this is just like the standard settings. So I'm just showing you how like the Wi-Fi is built in, didn't have to do anything to set up Wi-Fi, or the internet adapter worked before it was even installed. Audio adapters worked before it was even installed. Microphone worked before it was even installed. I always mute that though. I don't know why they defaulted to on. But again, unless you're using some type of Microsoft or Apple or, one of those types of app stores, you don't really have to worry about somebody recording you in the background. But Cortana literally does send your private conversations back to quote unquote help with Cortana, speech recognition or something like that. But nobody asked for that. And VPNs come built in, so if you have like a IPVanish or NordVPN or something like that, you can set it up really easy and straightforward in Linux. And here I've stunted the installer because instead of waiting for the updates, I started using the computer. It's best to just let it finish before you interrupt it by trying to do two things at once, like I'm doing here, trying to be efficient. Just take your time, go slow, let it finish what it's doing before you do something else, just for the installer. After that, it can multitask like crazy, but if you're installing 50 applications all at the same time and they're all using like shared packages and they're trying to update it while you're running a program that's using it, it's just... So here I'm just typing in a question I got. I don't know how to use Manjaro. I've never used it before. So I just say how to update Manjaro, and one of the first links you get tells you exactly how to do it graphically. And if you just want to get it done and you don't want to follow instructions, it'll just give you a command that you can enter. So there's the command. SYU is system update. They explain the command, they explain how it works, but if you want to just skip down to the instructions, it's as straightforward as either watching a video or copy and pasting the command itself. So I usually just do the command line because I like to learn it, but definitely don't have to. There's the software updater. Again, the search function works beautifully. It's just a little bit twitchy because of my recording device here. If it looks like it's skipping. So we'll start with some simple things like changing the background, get something a little bit nicer, easier on the eyes. And this is the terminal, the command line. And I'm just entering in the command that I looked up on the internet there in a couple seconds. And then it failed, and I'm like, oh, why would it fail? So I go back to the... well, I guess I should restart it first since I did all those updates and installed all those applications. And then it fails again. Could not find... what is it? Failed to prepare transactions. Could not resolve dependencies. So basically what it's doing is like certain programs need certain other programs to work. And if you're updating one program and it needs to restart before it's actually active, then another program can't use it until after you've restarted. So when you first set up Linux, you're going to want to reboot and update and reboot and update and install, then reboot, and you just do that a few times. But if you're running off a spinning mechanical hard drive, reboots are kind of slow, but if you've got an SSD, it takes less than 10 seconds, 14, 15 seconds maybe to reboot. So count yourself lucky that you weren't born in the 80s. So when I was in the 90s and 2000s having to do tech support and stuff, you had to wait a long time for constantly rebooting these systems. Not for Linux, but for Windows. Back then, Linux was much faster just because it was a lot less user-friendly. They didn't have all this graphical sugar. So you can see you can access your Windows drives and stuff from Linux, but just keep in mind you can't access your Linux drives from Windows. So it's only a one-way street because Windows doesn't play with Linux, but Linux can try to play with Windows. So this is just sort of a feature of Budgie. It's got this dropout window with your notifications that pops out from the side. I kind of like it, but I've never really used Budgie too much just because my use case was more for productivity. So I picked Linux Mint because it worked the best as far as like computer processing power, efficiency, and I like the file manager. But the one downside of Linux Mint is that the file manager is really bad at doing huge file transfers. You can do it in the console, no problem, but it hangs and freezes if you try and do it. So here I'm just looking up that error that we saw before where it failed to prepare transaction. I just type in my distro name, which is Manjaro, and then the question I have. Invariably, somebody else has already had that same question, so the answer's out there somewhere. And here I found my answer right here. So I advise you all to write this down. And I'll probably put this in the description notes too, but the pacman-mirrors. Pacman is the command for the package manager. Mirrors is basically the locations to where all your updates are going to be found. This is like a one-time thing, but you should do it as soon as you install the operating system. That should be the first thing you do. I didn't know that at the time because, like I said, I've never used Manjaro before. I've used a Budgie distribution, which looks the same, but it's not running on the same kernel. Manjaro uses Pacman and Linux Mint and Debian, and the other distributions I run all use apt. So Control-Shift-V to paste. Normally it's just Control-V to paste, but Control-Shift-V in the terminal because it's protecting you from, some outside source arbitrarily pasting code or copying code into your clipboard and then pasting it and running code that you don't want it to run. The terminal is so powerful it's got to protect you from stuff like that. But if you look at the instructions here from a trusted source, and you know what it's doing, feel free to use the command line, but that should be the only command line you actually have to run. And there's probably a visual way to do it, but I'm not very familiar with Manjaro, so I could run the sudo pacman update from in here, but it's already running in the graphical version, and the graphical version just uses the terminal anyway, so it would just sort of trip itself if I tried to do it both at the same time. So, you just gotta wait for it to finish. I'm impatient, so I keep causing errors. So it's still finishing, still finishing. And then it just gives you a whole bunch of technical details, gobbledygook, logs it for you. And I'll just show you quickly what it looks like to browse the App Store. These are all free, so you can open them up, have a look, see what they do. You can browse them. I'll show you another viewing arrangement later, but you can browse them in a list like this, or you can browse them in tile organization, so you can see more on the page at the same time. These are utilities you can download, and I'll just fast forward a bunch of these so you can see how many there are. So anything you can imagine to do on your computer, there's definitely a free program that'll help you do it. So here are just some that I'm downloading just for the sake of showing you what our use case is for. Again, if you want to run Windows applications and stuff, you can run them in Linux. And one of the ways of doing it is with Wine, W-I-N-E. Play on Linux if you want to play games or run Steam or something like that. I think that comes pre-installed with popOS, but Pop is the other installer that we didn't finish going through. I just showed you quickly. This is Manjaro, so you got to set it up manually just because they don't want to assume what you want to do with your computer and just fill it full of garbage, right? So the downside to not having your computer filled with garbage is that when you set it up the first time, you actually have to tell it what you want to install. But everything's free. And you can choose a bunch of add-ons, but you're not forced to get them. So like if I choose not to get a Mac backend or something, I can just unselect it and then pick the ones I do want. And then you don't have that bloat. And this is the reason predominantly why Linux is so much faster than Windows. It's because no matter what Windows does, and no matter how good their developers and programmers and coders are, they're always throwing stuff on your computer that you don't need or want. And that's going to take up space, it's going to slow your computer down, and in Windows it'll run in the background. But with Linux, they're all compartmentalized. That's why they give you all these lists of features and like dependencies, they call them. They're basically like scripts and programs that are required to run this other program that you want to run. But it asks your permission basically before it's allowed to do anything. Whereas with Windows or Mac, if you just install a program that you say bought or downloaded, it can just run in the background and say like start crypto mining on your processor when you don't want it to, or updating when you don't want it to, or borrowing system resources that you don't want it to. These are all sort of self-contained and compartmentalized on your system, so they only run when you tell them to run, and you can tell them to run on startup and boot, and I'll show you that in the settings. But here are just some important programs to get. The GNU Image Manipulation program, that's what I use for all my graphics. It's like Photoshop, but it's free. Inkscape is like Illustrator, so it's for vector graphics. Very, very powerful tool. It's also free. And I'll just show you again another layout view of the package installer and stuff. This is just the tile version instead of the straight list. But Blender is what I use for my 3D modeling. That's how we made the intros to all these Frivolous Gravitas videos. It's a free 3D animation studio, basically. Fantastic, fantastic tool. A huge community too. Like for free education and teaching you how to do it. And so some other programs I might recommend. Kodi, if you want to watch streaming TV. Like live TV or like a Kodi box or anything like that. You can run it off Linux. It's essentially just a Linux app, but those little Kodi boxes run off Linux. Mpv Media Player is a really lightweight media player. There's no big bubbly frames or pop-ups, or doesn't bug you at all. OpenShot is what I do. I'm using it right now for all my videos. What else we got on here? Scribus is what I use to make my my cookbook. It's like a desktop publishing. So if you're doing magazines or pamphlets, things like that, excellent free open source project. What else we got on here? I'll just install what I got. CUDA is an nVidia support. It's like a graphics accelerator built into graphics cards. My laptop doesn't have CUDA, but my computer does. I use it to render all these videos. tkinter is a Python library, so if you're getting into programming and stuff, you're probably going to be using a lot of it for image manipulation, if that's your thing. I got Bluetooth on my laptop, so I'll add that. Remember, it asks your permission. That's what that authentication required is. It's because if you know that you're trying to install something and it asks you, hey, something's trying to get installed on your computer, then you know that you can... Oh, diagram editor is awesome. Definitely get that. If you know that you're trying to install something on your computer and it asks you for your permission, then you can give it permission. But if it suddenly pops up and you're browsing a website that you've never been to before, don't give it permission. It's probably somebody trying to scam you. It's not like Windows where it only asks you once and then it forever allows it. It's going to ask you every time. And some people find that annoying and you can turn it off, but I would suggest keeping it on because once you get used to it, it's a nice security blanket to know that even if you make a mistake or go to a wrong website or click on a wrong link, that there's at least some protection on your system. It's not just going to go hog wild and install whatever it wants. So Libra Office is what I use for, PowerPoint presentations or the Microsoft Word, Excel, all that kind of stuff. Office work equivalents. Firefox comes built in, but you can also get Chrome or the Chromium project, or Edge even works in Linux. If you really like Edge, you can install Edge. And again, to look up or figure out how to do things, all you have to do is type it in the Google search or Brave search or whatever search engine you want and type in exactly what it says. I highly recommend that anybody use typing commands using the sudo prefix, the super user do. That's like the highest level permission on your system. It's always best to know what the command does before you just type it randomly, and certainly don't type in anything just because you saw it in one place. Make sure that other people have reviewed that comment and command and it's safe. I like Tilix, so I just want to install it explicitly. I didn't see it in this list. It might be in there, but I'm just going to show you how the command line works. And this is what it looks like to install things from the command line. So, really straightforward. It's just not graphical. But it gives you that real granular control of what's going in and out of your computer when you do it manually. You know for a fact that nothing is being installed alongside, like a Bing search bar or some kind of phony antivirus, or that type of data skimming is just not allowed in Linux. And then you can just keep running the same command, but with different program names. So if you know the name of the package that you want to install, and again, after you've been using Linux for a while, you can use one command to just save all the applications that you've installed. And then when you install a new version or a new distro of Linux, you can just run one command to install everything from that file, and that file will have the names of all of the programs you've ever installed, and you can do it all at one shot instead of having to go through the lists like I'm doing here. So this is sort of a one-time thing, if you want it to be. If you want to do it every time, you feel free to do so, obviously. But most people will just save the, once they've got everything they like and they're working on their system and like 6 months have gone by and they're like, yeah, these are all the programs I need, or all your basic programs, just save it to a file and stick it somewhere. And then if you ever do want to try a new distro of Linux, you don't have to go through them one by one, installing them one at a time. You can just install them all from a file and it'll take the list of names of the programs you like and just run with it, which is nice. It's much, much faster than Windows or Mac in that regard. Oh, here's a, it asked me when I tried to install Libra Office from the command line, there are two different versions of this Libra Office. There's fresh and still. Enter a number, either 1 or 2, to say which one. I don't know the difference between the two, so I just go into the web browser, search my question. Fresh versus still, and then it answers. Fresh is the stable version with the most recent features. LibreOffice Still is the stable version that has undergone a longer testing time, so that'll be the more stable. So there's stable and more stable, still or fresh. I don't need new features, I'm just going to use standard Office stuff, so I'll stay with the still. And then I'll keep browsing while that's going on. But you can see even any of the names that you find in one list in the graphical app store or whatever, you can install them manually using that same name too. So all the graphical interface is doing is putting a command line in the background for you so that it just abstracts away the terminal so you don't have to use the command line. But it's still using it. And it's using it because it's such a powerful tool. There's no reason to get rid of it. It's not there because you have to use the terminal, it's there because it's useful to use the terminal. So if it scares you or find it daunting or cumbersome, just don't use it. But if you recognize how powerful it is, and or you have a problem that you need solved and somebody has this big long list of instructions on how to fix your problem, or you can just type in one command, copy and paste, and it's done, it's usually a lot easier to do that. There's a ton of games and stuff too. Again, no ads. They're all just free games. That Tux cart is like Super Mario Kart, but it's an open source copy version. But I hear it's really good as far as Mario Kart goes. ZSNES is an emulator for Super Nintendo. One of my favorites. Here I'm just looking up how to install Tor, because it didn't show up in that in the graphical list there. So there's a different store that you can use called Snap, and it tells you exactly how to set up Snap. So I'm going to install Tor through Snap following the instructions that they've provided. So I'm just going to cancel out of what I was doing before, and I'm going to follow the instructions on the right there from the web browser. And you can see how fast it is to just look things up, because guaranteed somebody's had the question before. And if you want to know what the commands do, you're free to just look it up and see what it's doing before you enter it in. But if you want to just trust them, because, you know, if you wreck your Linux distro on something you've downloaded, you can just reinstall over it. Takes not too much time. And you see, it's all pretty straightforward, as scary as it looks. I'm just installing the Snap store, and then I'm going to install Tor from the Snap store. Rather than through Pacman, I'm using Snap. So essentially, Snap is just another package manager. It's just got a different name and a different way of working. It's got different applications that work with it too. So sometimes you'll find things that only on the Snap store, but not on these other stores. But that's all going to be specific to each distro of Linux too. Let's see if I can stop that flickering again. There we go. Mostly. So these are just the basic system settings. I'll show you some of the ways you can customize your distribution. I'll set up the automatic time and date. You can see it's not appearing properly up there for now, but it'll work out once I've finished doing all my installations and I reboot. It'll look snazzy. But networking's all working, obviously. Keyboard, mouse, touchpad, didn't have to install any of that. You've got accessibility features, so if you hard of sight or need zooming or the magnifying lens, things like that you might be used to in Mac or Microsoft products, it's all available in Linux too. User controls are easy to find. They're not buried in the control panel settings somewhere, like in some other operating systems. And now this is a list of all the applications I've installed. These are not pre-installed. A lot of them are pre-installed, but only the basics get pre-installed for you, and that's just so that you don't have to set up your keyboard and your audio drivers and your Bluetooth and blah blah blah. Each distribution of Linux will have different pre-installed apps to try and help you out, so picking a distribution is more about the apps and stuff that's built into it, more than it is about Linux itself. But now we get into the customizations after a quick reboot. So there's my boot menu again. Just use the arrow keys if I want to boot into Windows, or I can just wait for the timer to run out and it'll automatically boot into Linux. And I've just changed the background a bit. Played around with a bit of the other settings just to show you what it looks like when you customize it and personalize it. You probably don't want to sit there and watch me fiddle through settings and play with it though, so I just sort of paused the video and went ahead and did my own thing. But you'll see at the bottom there I've got a second search bar, or taskbar I mean, and I've got it floating so it looks kind of like the Mac layout. Those are completely editable. I've got a floating pane on the left with a launcher, and it's just another way of launching all the same applications you get from this menu here. Just another layout for it, so if you prefer the app layout, there's a third way of presenting it that I've got at the bottom. I'll show you in just a sec though. This is one of my favorites, is the Workspace Switcher, so you can have like all your music on one window and just leave it open. All your work on another one, so your emails on another one, so you don't need to keep like minimizing and then opening and then minimizing and then opening windows if you're working on many different things at once. It's fantastic for students, or if you work in an office or something. If you've got like your schedules on one pane, you can just leave them open instead of having them, occupying space on your taskbar and shrinking everything else, or getting in the way if you've got them floating around. You see the time's all up and running now. And again, you can change the clock and all that kind of good stuff. But yeah, I think you can have like up to 9 workspaces or something like that. So 9 different windows that you switch through, and they don't have to be at the bottom there. I've just pinned them to that taskbar. Here's the other apps that I've got installed. It's just another layout for all the same programs, so you choose whichever one you like best. And again, you can put this one on the top left and the other one on the bottom, and the other launcher that's on the left, you can move it over to the right. You can add little spacers to organize all the icons on the taskbar. You can change the colors and positionings. You can add whatever apps or widgets you want, so you can throw in like weather things, but they're not they're not pre-installed there for you. and like annoying you if you didn't want them there. Standard trash bin. This is just showing you how you can move things around the panels, like fully customizable, these things. And it's really straightforward and easy to use. It's a bit cumbersome to have to like add applet, then select it, then add applet, and then select it, especially if you're going to use a whole bunch of like separators and spacers like I like to do. But you do it once and then you never have to do it again, so it's not so bad. It just takes a few seconds. And this is just to show you that I can have that menu from the top left. I can also put it on the bottom, and I can have two of them. I could have one that looks like those tile apps, and I have the other one on the other side that, you know, maybe more organized if I know exactly what I'm looking for, but I can't remember the name of the program. However you want to work it. What else do I have on here? About 7 minutes of stuff. Oh yeah, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the workspace switching. So if I've got settings on one window space, empty windows or browser on this other window space, just to look something up, you can just switch between these window spaces without having to minimize anything. Or you can have something recording in the background and then switch over to your Zoom call, for instance. Or if you've got OBS Studio running like I do, you can have one window doing recording. For that, screen captures, gaming, if that's your thing. And those panels on the left bar, those are adjusting the panels on my screen. The top, you can see everything moving up there as I move the spacer open. That's the top panel, and then if you select the left, the bottom dock, and the left dock. But you can add as many of these as you want. There's only so much room on the screen, but you can do it. Some distros you can even change it per workspace, so you can have this type of taskbar layout on the left on your main workspace, and then you can have another with no taskbars at all that's just completely open. So if you're doing graphic design work where you want as much screen real estate as possible, you could do all your graphics work on a screen space that doesn't have any docks obscuring your view. And this is just switching it over to the right, show you that you can run the same things from the right or the left. But I'm not sure Manjaro, like I said, this is the first time I'm using Manjaro, and you can tell how easy it is because I've never used it before, but I can still, you know, navigate it pretty easily and make all the adjustments I want. It's all pretty straightforward, even if you've never seen it before, which is nice. Find a lot of the settings are buried into these obscure places on Windows, especially now with the control center being changed to app. Like control panel used to at least be centralized, but now if you want to back up a disk image, you have to like look up back and then find a backup utility tool, and then there's like a blue link in the Window Explorer on the left that says burn an image. Like you can't just do a search for burn an image to disk like you can with Linux. You have to know exactly where to find it. And that means if you look it up online, the instructions are going to be go here, click here, then do this, then do that. It's way harder to follow that type of instruction set than have somebody just say, you could do that, and here's where it's placed, and it's all in one spot, like settings, where if you just do a search for settings, you'll find every app that changes every setting on your computer. If you know the name of the app, it'll pull up all the apps, whereas like the search function in Windows starts pulling up ads and stuff like that if you're looking for something on your own computer, which is asinine if you really think about it. But yeah, you can see that calendar docking can go left, right, whatever you want. This is all just like customization. Like you really don't have to do any of this if you're not interested, but oh, and in case you're wondering, the reason why my battery is showing at 0% is because I burned out my laptop crypto mining 10 years ago. It overheated because, like I said, it was a cheap laptop. Oh, and if you want to change like fonts and stuff, it's very straightforward. You don't need like a registration key. You'll notice I never once put in an email address. Like Linux has no idea who I am or where I am, or they don't keep track or tabs of you at all unless unless you opt in to help them, the developers, like make the product better. So if you're not doing anything private or personal, definitely show your support to the developers and opt in. And that way they can just, update their kernels with like driver support for the hardware that you're using, because you might have a piece of equipment that somebody else's doesn't have, or maybe they need a certain number of people to be using like a really obscure, outdated network driver for them to know that it's still useful to maintain it. Excuse me. In future versions of Linux. So it just helps them know where to focus their energies as they're updating the product, which is free. So if you can help them out, then it's only going to help you out. But it also shows support. Like an active community showing support is the best thing you can do for open source, is acknowledge and thank them for it, which is what I'm intending to do by promoting Linux, is to thank them for all the wonderful tools that I wouldn't have access to were it not for them. Not just the developers of Manjaro or whatever, but like Linux as a whole and the whole free open source community, the FOSS community, FOSS. And that goes for like Stack Exchange and message boards and all of that too. I mean, without them, it would be really hard to know all the commands that you could possibly use in Linux, right? Again, just showing you that there's some in-terminal applications that you can run, and you can have those running in the background. Sort of like Task Manager, where you can see your CPU core usage and all that. I guess my computer's got, 4 cores, or the laptop I'm using here. And I updated the RAM, upgraded the RAM on it, so I think it came with 4 and I got 8, or it came with 2 and I got 6, something like that. But it's not an especially powerful computer. It's only a 2.5 gigahertz or something. With comparison, they've got 5 gigahertz out now, and instead of 4 cores and 4 threads, they have like minimum is 4 cores and 8 threads, so hyper-threading. But the new processors have like 32 cores and 64 threads. So again, I'm just playing around with some settings here to show you that, there's fonts pre-installed, all the ones you're regular to. They got different names, obviously, because Microsoft and Apple don't play nice with intellectual property. But the options are all there. And you can download free fonts from Google. They've got thousands on there. So you can change all the scaling. You can change like just the title bars, or anything that you can do in Windows, you can do in here. And the interface is different, but it's not like it's crazy complicated. It's just instead of being on the top, it's on the side, that type of thing. Like it's not drastically different from Windows, it's just slightly different. As long as you can read, you're fine. And that's that. Remember, I started with this. This was the bootloader for Ubuntu Studio. The nice thing about Ubuntu Studio is it does come with graphics drivers like the other ones do, and it does have an installer that gives you the install alongside option. So if you want a dual boot, Ubuntu Studio is a good one for that. The downside to it is it does come with like a whole bunch of programs pre-installed, but that's the point of it. It's made for like video and audio production and creativity and graphic design, 3D modeling, all that kind of stuff. So if you don't need any of that, it's just sort of bloatware, right? It's stuff taking up space on your hard drive that you don't need, and when you start searching for apps, you're going to have like 100 things that you've never heard of that all look confusing, and so you don't really want stuff on your computer that you're not using, because then it just gets in your way and it's harder to find things. But yeah, hope you found that helpful. I'm sure we could have made it quicker and all that, but I think thorough is always best, and you can skip around as you will in your own time. But I guess just to give you some idea of like how I run my system here and what it looks like to actually do work. I mean, other than the fact that I've customized it, you wouldn't know any different from, well, other than the fact that it actually works, but so this is a backup utility I really like called, what's it called? Timeshift. And it's really simple and straightforward. You just set schedules, which users, apply filters to what you want and don't want backed up, and all it's doing is running an rsync command, which is a synchronization command built into Linux. So you can run cron jobs are great too. They're chronological or sort of things that you want just to run automatically or on timers or on schedules or anything like that. But as you can see, like, zoom and everything is just the same as you're used to. Chrome, Chromium, Firefox. Yeah. Everything runs just like you'd normally think it would. It's just no BS, no bloat. Your computer is not going to expire or get old. If it works now, it'll always work this well. It's not going to like start getting worse. And yeah, I switched and I never looked back. I understand the fear entirely, but take the plunge. It's well worth your while. So, signing out. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.